Started. We're in the book of Numbers, chapter 28 through chapter, I think it's past 30. 32 is what we're going to be going through. Numbers 28 through 32. And this is one of those lessons where if you're bored and you don't want to talk about what we're talking about, give me 10 minutes because we're going to talk about something totally different. It's a smorgasbord. And so we're covering a lot of different things. Now, as you get started here, remember we have just traveled through and we are right on the verge of entering into the promised land. We are about to do our big Deuteronomy sermon where Moses is going to speak his last sermon and then he will go on a mountain and be buried by the Lord. And then we're about to have Joshua rise up and we're about to cross the Red Sea and get after Jericho. So we have traveled to that point. All these things from the end of the book of Numbers that we're doing right here to the book of Joshua, all that's going to happen in about the span of about a month and a half to 3 months. And so we took a long time in 40 years in the book of Numbers, and now we're about to fly through some scriptures here really quick from books of the Bible. And so you'll notice we don't travel as much right now. We will here just for a little bit in the war. But generally, we are right at the spot of being across from the city of Jericho. And we'll look at a map here, Lord willing, in a few minutes. But every time there's 3 movements in the book of Numbers, Sinai to Kadesh, and in Kadesh around to eventually we'll head up here to Mount Nebo. And each time between those movements, we cover especially sacrifice and a lot of Levitical rules. And then we'll cover a few things that happen at each place. And so we have done our last traveling, so now we're about to go over some rules. And let me tell you, we're about to hit some major rules in 28 and 29. And then we will talk about the things that happened while we're here at Mount Nebo. Now, in your daily Bible reading, you hit chapter 28 and you hit chapter 29, and you think, oh my goodness, here we are again. Numbers is designed, it seems, to almost knock out your daily Bible reading. Because you begin and you end it with the census, and then you have this section about sacrifices. And so you'll run through, and as you run through, you're going to see, okay, we sacrifice a lamb here, you sacrifice a goat here, you sacrifice a bull here, you have an ephah of flour, you have some olive oil, you have some wine. Okay, on this day you're going to do this, and on this day you're going to do that. And if you wanted to, we could really nerd ourselves out as we go through, and I say nerd ourselves out, look at each individual thing and what it represents and what it means. You may remember, it may not. It was about 6 years ago. We were covering the law of Moses, and we're in the book of Leviticus. And we built ourselves a little tabernacle up here. We had our altar, and we had our holy place, and we had the ark, and we had the incense, which was here. And we sacrificed a doll lamb. I don't know if you remember that or not. It got stuff in everywhere. But that was, we could go through and do that again. We're not going to go through and do that again. In fact, we're kind of going to gloss over this because I think it's best for us to look at it from a distance. But if you look at your sheet, you see that chart, and you see all the sacrifices which are going on. Know it in this point, every morning, every night, a lamb is put to death. And if you recall that tabernacle class we did, you can kind of picture it. If you can't recall it, remember the size we're looking at. The tabernacle is, imagine this auditorium like this, doubled. If you took this and picked it up and put it that way, that's the size that the Holy and Holy of Holies of Holies would have. And really, that's about the size of the tabernacle. If you go from about this point back to where the baptistry is, that's your point. That's around the size of what the Holy of Holies is. As you enter into the tabernacle, you're going to come through that opening gate, and you're only allowed to go there if you're a priest. You're going to come to the altar, and this is where all the killing's being done, all the big things which are there. You're going to have your showbread on one side. You're going to have, well, the showbread, if you're looking this way, is going to be on this side. You're going to have your candlesticks on the other side. And then you're going to have your place where the incense is made. It's a bronze laver, a bronze bowl. And you burn incense there, and it fills the place up with smoke. And then you have a very thick curtain. It's about a foot thick, and it's about 40 feet tall. And you go behind that curtain, and that's where the Ark of the Covenant is. And you're only allowed to go back there once a year, the high priest, on the Day of Atonement. And so what you see here is what's being put to death at the very opening of the tabernacle, at this one altar. And over a year, you can see that there's 113 bulls, 1,086 lambs, about a ton of flour, 1,000 ephahs, or we would call it a bottle. It's about the same as a bottle of wine or a bottle of oil. That is what's being sacrificed. Of course, each one's being done a little bit at a time. Every morning, every evening, we sacrifice a lamb. Day of Atonement, you have your lambs, and you see them being taken out and taken care of, and all these things. And that's what you see here in this picture is the Day of Atonement. You have 2 rams or lambs which are brought up, and on one you lay your hand on it, and on that lamb you say, okay, this has all the sins of all the people this year. And then you take that lamb or ram out of the city, let it go, and it lives wild away from you. And the other one is the lamb which is going to die for your sins, and he is sacrificed upon the temple, upon the altar there. And so that's what you see there in that idea of what's going on there. That's more of a temple idea as you look around, but it happened from the tabernacle all the way through the temple, even to this point. Now, not to be graphic, not to be gross, every time you sacrifice something, you bring it to the altar, you pray over it, you slice its throat, and let the blood run out on the ground. And then you lift it up, put it on the altar, and then you take out the entrails and put it to the side, and those will be burned up absolutely, completely. You cut up the lamb, set it around, let it burn. And while it's burning, the priest is allowed to take a portion of it for himself. And that's one of the ways in which the priests and the Levites would feed themselves. And so you see this long, intricate thing which is going on. For you and I today, it would absolutely gross us out. It would be a nasty experience. When Solomon instituted the temple, he sacrificed in one day over 1,000 bulls. Josephus, as he is talking about what the Jerusalem temple looked like, and he is talking somewhere in the range of 40 AD, about 10 years after the time of Jesus, he would say within the temple at this time, there wasn't very good drainage, that it would be almost knee deep, half your shin deep in just blood from everything that was being sacrificed that day. Because it's not just the requirements here, people themselves would also be bringing lambs and bulls and pigeons and whatever else it may be for their personal. This is all on this sheet just for the nation. And so there is a lot of death which is going on here. And for the vast majority of us, this would be revolting. We would not want to be anywhere around this, between the sounds, between the smells, between the sights. None of it would be good. We wouldn't want to be around any of that stuff at all. And so let's talk about, that's the reason I don't really want to get into it all that deeply. Let's talk about these lessons here. All right. Imagine the money that it took to sacrifice this many animals. I don't raise sheep, I don't raise cattle, but I know they are very, very expensive, especially nowadays they're getting to be even more expensive. Imagine if every year you had to bring a cow, or every year you had to bring a goat. The price would be huge. And what the Lord is telling us as we read through this Old Testament is just how expensive it is to follow God. It's expensive, and it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of planning. If you're going to sacrifice 1,000 goats in a day, and it has to be done during the daylight hours, you're going to have a system. And it's going to look, almost like a little line of people working there to get that to work that quickly, that fast, to have that done. And so the Lord is telling us that following him is neither cheap nor easy. Now, we are not under the Old Testament. Sadly, there's a lot of preachers, even in the Lord's church, who are trying to say, we're still under that Old Testament. And there's really not a difference between the two. We are not under the Old Testament because there's no sacrifice. Because Jesus is our sacrifice today. And thankfully, you don't have to travel to Jerusalem once a year with a goat or with a cow or whatever it is that you go with. Thankfully, you don't have to worship the way that they worship back then. We are under such a better covenant, and it is a better way of life. It is a much more wonderful way to live. Second thing, you imagine the pain that's going on in here, just with the animals. Do animals feel pain? Sure, they feel pain. And you can imagine the horror these animals are facing. You can imagine what's going on. The faces of the kids as they're seeing this happen for the very first time. Why did God demand blood sacrifice? Why do you think? What you got?
Emphasize the seriousness of sin.
All right, shows the seriousness of sin. Okay, the wages of sin, Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. Okay, the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. Death. Sin brings forth death. And so while people were not dying themselves, every year they were watching something precious to them, something that they absolutely loved. They're watching that die. Now, I love my puppy dog. I don't know if I love my kitty cat, but he hangs out in the house sometimes if I don't have him out. Okay? If somebody were to do that to a cat or a dog of mine, I would not be impressed at all, would I? A lot of times when we think about these cattle and we think about these goats, we're thinking about the way we live. You know, oh, we'll just go out in the field, we'll bring one in, you know, we'll act like we're going to give them hay, and then we'll throw them in the trailer and we'll just take them off. They raised their animals very differently back then than they do today. Maybe you remember we had a missionary here from India several years ago. He was going through his slides and he was showing where the people there in that section where he was working loved their water buffalo so much that they brought it into the house and they would lay around it at night because that water buffalo would give off so much heat. And I was thinking to myself, no, you know, that does not impress me at all. You know, I would not be excited about that at all. But you studied the people in that time. Those animals were usually brought inside. You didn't want them stolen, and they had a very good relationship with these animals as well. So you can imagine the pain that sin caused. You also see the blessing as these sins are rolled away. And you also see the hope. Remember, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. But the first time we see that John the Baptizer sees Jesus in the New Testament, what's he say? John 1:29, behold, there's the Lamb of God. He takes away the sins of the world. He was sacrificed once for all for our sin. And so there you see in these sacrifices a reenactment of what's going to come when Jesus dies on that cross. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be terrible to watch. It's going to be revolting to us. But that cross is beautiful because of what it represents to every single one of us. Number 3, sacrifice of Jesus greater than the blood of bulls and goats. It's still expensive. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The only other time we see a person who is commanded to sacrifice his son, and actually this word is used in the Septuagint, which is the Greek, the monogenes, one of a kind. The only time it's commanded in the Old Testament, Abraham, go sacrifice your son, your only begotten son, Isaac. And so Abraham, by faith, went up that mountain. He prepared his son to be a sacrifice, but as he raised the knife to slit the throat, God stopped him because God's not going to ask us to do more than he does himself. As a matter of fact, God's not going to ask us to do the same as he does himself. Yes, sir, Jim?
Did these sacrifices end after the events of 70 AD?
Yeah. The question is, did these sacrifices end after the events of 70 AD? Yeah. At that point, the temple was destroyed. There was nowhere to go and do these sacrifices. There was no place to do them anymore because in the Jewish faith, you had to use that altar. You weren't allowed to, as in the day of patriarchs, build an altar anywhere you wanted. And so when that altar was destroyed, there no longer was the daily sacrifices which would be done there. The entire system of the Old Testament was done away with and was destroyed. And so there's some premillennial thought and some new heaven, new earth thought that there's going to be a new temple built. And some people act like there's going to be a sacrifice system again, which makes no sense because our sacrifice, as Hebrews says, once and for all, is Jesus. And so Jesus is going to fill that place. We don't need a sacrifice anymore. And in the afterlife, there will be no more sin because Satan will be gone, sin will be gone. There will be no need for sacrifice. So yeah, all that's gone. What you got, Marilyn?
Well, the Jews today believe only in the Old Testament, don't
Portions. The question is, did the Jews today believe in the Old Testament? Yeah, the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the law primarily. It depends on what kind of Jew you are, but they don't follow any form of daily sacrifices. Now, they want there to be a restored temple someday so they can restart those sacrifices.
How do they get around that if they believe in the Torah? How do they get around that?
Well, there's just, they're not able to have a temple. Unless you have a temple and unless you have your altar, there's no place to do it.
Who are they waiting on to build the new temple?
Hopefully not us. That is a loaded question. You get down there and where the temple is supposed to be, there's a Muslim mosque, the Temple of the Dome. And, everybody wants that piece of real estate. I mean, it's more expensive than some of those places in Nashville right now. And a lot of people are fighting over it, and you have daily riots, I think, about that area. Now, if the Jews ever took over that area, I don't know how quickly they'd build a temple, because that'd be awfully expensive. And most Jews today is not a religion, it's a culture. You culturally are circumcised, you culturally follow a lot of the things, but they would probably be more what we'd say agnostic. It's a culture that they have, that they follow. Ethan, do you have something?
No, I was just going to kind of go along the same thing.
Yeah.
The reason that they don't do it any longer is that very reason, is the lack of the temple.
Yeah, the lack of the real estate. And they're like, if we could just have that area, and the Muslims are like, nope. And, I think it used to be a temple, then it turned into a church, then it turned into a mosque, and, it trades around every couple centuries.
So they got to rebuild this new temple at the site of the old one, is that their thing?
That's the goal.
They can't just go over here and build a temple?
They don't want to because that place is not considered holy. Yeah, they still have the west wall, which is the foundation of the temple. At the very end of 2 Samuel, you have Araunah's floor. It's the threshing floor that Araunah had. And David has done a census, and he's gotten in huge trouble for it. And so he goes and he has to make a sacrifice to pay for it, which we'll get to that in just a little bit. He has to make a sacrifice to pay for it. And so he says, I need your oxen, I need your cart. And Araunah says, listen, I don't want people to die, just take it. And David says, I'm not going to give to God that which costs me nothing. And that sacrifice, that sacrificial attitude, caused that to be the place where David would place the tabernacle and where Solomon would place the temple. And that's the area we're looking at. But it's considered to be holy, I think, to them.
When you answered Jim's question,
Yeah.
you said, though, that history tells us that they did continue to offer sacrifices until 70 AD.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, well, I guess what confuses me, when Christ died, the veil of the temple was torn in two. So if they needed the temple, how did they continue?
Okay. Yeah. Matt's question is, with the death of Jesus, you had the ripping of the veil, the ripping of the curtain between the holy place and the other, not the almost holy place, I guess you'd say. Holy place, most holy place. From my understanding of history, they just kind of patched it up and fixed it because, and this is where some modern preachers will get into this. Paul actually went to the temple twice and made sacrifices. And so people will say, well, if Paul was still making sacrifices, then we're still under the Jewish law as well. I don't think that's how you should read that. Paul went and made these sacrifices to try to placate the Jews. He was going through a cultural experience with these people, kind of saying, I'm sorry for the things I've done, and going through it. He wasn't following the old law. I don't think you can read Galatians and think that Paul was a fan of the Old Testament, or at least a fan of still following the Old Testament. And you'd have a lot of trouble in Romans 6 and Romans 5 to say that he was a fan of still being under it. Any other questions?
Mark,
Yes.
we know that the blood of bulls and goats.
Yeah.
saved. But at that period of time when they were making those sacrifices and spreading that blood, that's what it was for God had told them to do.
Right. It rolled those sins back.
And what he kind of thinking that that's going to
Right, right. You talking about Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the leaders in the Jewish church asked Paul to go. When you take an oath, you would shave your head, and then you would go and offer the sacrifice. And he shaved his head twice and went and offered that sacrifice. Yes, sir, Dan?
Also, interesting as you study the sacrifice, on your page where goats, and it has a column
Yes.
all the way down. It's interesting because a goat was always used for a sin offering. And it never says that it was pleasing to the Lord.
Right.
Because it represented sin. A lamb of
And if you've ever raised goats, you would understand.
That's right. And also in the New Testament says that
Right, Beth? Right?
at the end of
All
time,
right.
there's going to be a separation of the sheep and the goat.
Right.
And so Christ came as a lamb, but he died as a goat. And so we need to understand the significance of that. God transformed him from a lamb of the sheep to a goat as a sacrifice for sin, and that was for us.
Right.
He did
Oh,
it for us.
absolutely. And let me tell you, we could do a 6-month class on this. There's a lot of significance if you watch this where we hit the 7th month, and you can imagine and this is a lunar calendar, and so that changes a lot of stuff. But you hit that 7th month, we are killing everything in that 7th month, and that's because talking about sin, talking about the completeness of the coming sacrifice that is coming. There is a lot of stuff that you can really get deep on this and really look at. But then half of us will be going, what in the world is going on? You know, but that's interesting stuff as you look at it. All right.
Hey, Mark.
Yes, ma'am.
How do Jewish people today think that they're getting forgiven of their sins if they don't sacrifice?
Okay. You're supposed to ask easy questions. We're married. Oh. All right, the question Rhonda just asked. The question is, if the Jews aren't making these sacrifices, then how do they expect forgiveness of sins today? And what they do is it's called exile. You remember the 70 years in exile in which the Jews were sent off to Babylon? They weren't able to have that daily sacrifice, was not able to go there until that temple was rebuilt and the temple was rededicated. It was one of those things where you just say, well, we'll do our best. You know, we'll do our best and depend on God. And as soon as we get it back, we're going to get right back into it. And there's here we are getting in weeds again. 4 periods of Jewish history where these sacrifices aren't happening. And of course, the wilderness is one. A little bit right before the time of David is another. The exile would be the 3rd one. Antiochus Epiphanes would be number 4. That's when the Roman general, or the Alexander the Great's 4 generals were fighting back and forth, and their Idumeans and all that sort of thing is going on. And then this is the 5th. And so they're hoping, you know, we're going through phases until the great Messiah comes. But one of those things where if you can't do it, you just think, well, God understands, and we're going to get that temple back quick as we can. And we'll just see whenever that happens.
Also,
Yeah.
you have to remember that the Muslims have a mosque where
Yeah.
the temple used to
Yeah,
be.
the dome, is it?
There would be a world war if they tried to
Yes.
build it up.
Now, who's been to Israel? It's called the Dome of the Rock, is that right? Okay, you got the Dome of the Rock, which is there, and the Muslims are defending it because in their faith, you know, you've got your 4 or 5 pilgrimage places. One of their prophets had a vision right there, just happened to be right there, of course. And so they defend it to their dying breath. They're going to hold on to that because it is a reflection of the faith that they have in their God. And then, of course, the Jews want it back. And, you know, we go back and forth with our wars and everything else as we do that sort of thing. Yes, sir.
Now, last comment,
Promise?
on the goats,
Yeah.
that's why in the nativity scene, you won't see a goat. Because
Okay.
the goat represents sin.
All right.
And so you won't see a goat in the nativity scene.
All right. Dan says you don't see goats in the nativity scene.
That's right.
Wow. Okay. Nativity scenes are hard because it's difficult to find 3 wise men. Right? Okay. I saw something the other day that said, you know, 3 wise men brought that. If 3 wise women would have come, it would have been diapers and formula, because they would have actually known what to bring. And, you know, maybe with a baby, maybe there's something to that. I don't know. Okay, so there's not a goat in the nativity scene.
No,
Okay,
because Christ is represented as a lamb of the sheep,
okay,
but he was made a goat to be sacrificed.
to be sacrificed for us.
Part of the sacrifice he made was taking on sin and being represented as a goat in the sacrifice scheme of things.
Okay,
So that was part of the thing he gave up for us.
okay, I'll believe you. It's talking about the goats and the sheep. Yes, and the goat would have eaten the entire nativity scene, and would have hopped up there on the bed, and would have been braying so loud or whatever else. Yeah. If you've ever raised goats, you can very well understand that. They just destroy everything, it feels like, and you can't ever keep them locked up. All right, chapter 30, okay? Chapter 30 is a great chapter if you're a chauvinist. And we probably won't cover that too much. Read the first 2 verses. You make a vow, you had better keep it. Okay? Now, why is this a big deal? These people are about to go to war. If you're in the middle of a war and everybody is trying to throw a sword or an arrow or a rock at you, you're going to make some promises to God. You know, God, just get me through this, right? I've joked in here before, and it's not really a joke, but I laugh about it now. I remember one time I was taking a final in Greek, and it was not going well, and I prayed to God, just let me pass this test, and I will be a missionary in Timbuktu. And I failed, so now I live in Benton, Kentucky. All right? You know, when you make a vow to God, it says here in chapter 31 and 2, you keep your vow. You absolutely keep the promise you made to God. Big deal. Because you go back to Judges, we got a guy named Jephthah. Remember that? That's what you always argue about in the book of Judges. Jephthah trying to live up to everybody. He was born, his mama was a prostitute. He sure didn't fit in. He's trying to be ultra religious, so he gets around his friends. He's like, this is how religious I am. Whatever comes out of my house, I'm just going to throw it up on the altar and sacrifice it. And he's expecting a goat, a cow, probably hoping it's a kitty cat, so he can get rid of that thing. It was his daughter. And we always argue, well, did he really, sacrifice his daughter? Most people say no. I think looking at the context of Judges and what Judges is trying to tell us about how bad these people are, there's a good chance he did sacrifice his daughter. Hannah, the mother of Samuel, is unable to have children. Her husband asked one of the dumbest questions ever. Hannah is crying every year when they go to the temple because she's making promises with God, let me have a child. Elkanah goes up to her and says, listen, I'm a great husband. Isn't that enough for you? No, right? Well, God answers her prayer, and she has Samuel, and she's made a promise. She has a child. She will dedicate him to God. And so when the child is weaned, she brings him back to the temple or back to the tabernacle, and he becomes the last judge and first prophet. All right, when you make a promise to God, you keep it. It honors God's answer to you. It honors God's nature of holiness, and it honors your faith. It shows something about you. Now, if you keep reading, all right, verse 3, okay? All right, if a young lady who's not married makes a vow, if the daddy hears about it and the daddy thinks it's not good, the daddy can negate it, okay? If a young lady who is married makes a vow and her husband hears it and her husband's like, what in the world? Then the husband can negate it if he does it immediately. All right, sounds awfully chauvinistic, doesn't it? But a lot of it has to do with property. You can't really give away property that doesn't belong to you. And so you need to have the agreement of the person who owns the property, which is there. That's kind of an interesting thing to look at and to study there. Okay, now Numbers 31, here we go. We're about to have us some fun. We have just traveled up, and as you go through Numbers 31, we are right across from Jericho, and God says, before we cross over to this river, let's fix something first. You got your Moabites or your Midianites. They're actually the same people. And if you remember about 5 chapters earlier, Balak Balak went and got Balaam. And it looks silly as we're watching it, because Balak's giving all this money to Balaam and saying, oh, curse these people, and Balaam tries to, and God just won't let him. And his donkey has an argument with him, and he tries, and he tries, and he tries, and he just can't do it. And Balak gets so mad that he starts clapping his hands. You know, he's just throwing everything everywhere, just upset with life. And you and I would read that and kind of laugh. It looks funny. Finally, Balaam says, listen, I can't curse them, but I can tell you what to do. Get all the ladies in your nation and send them among the Israelites and tempt those men. And when they commit adultery, God's going to cause a plague. And that happened. 24,000 of them died. So we hit Numbers 31, and God says, before we go to the promised land, I need 1,000 people from every tribe. And all of us get together. Phinehas, who led the cleansing of the people after the Moabitess women had committed adultery, Phinehas leads them over there, and they take out all 5 of the Moabite princes and Balaam. Balaam the prophet is put to death by Phinehas. They kill all the men, they burn all the houses, they burn everything, destroy everything, and then they bring home the goats and the cattle, the spoils of war, the gold and the silver, and the women. Okay? Moses looks around and is just like, okay, these women just caused 24,000 of you to die. Why are you bringing the women back into camp? Does that make sense? Okay, if you're a younger man, it may make sense. All right, but he says, no, can't do this. So they kill all the women who are older, who participated in that sin. The younger ladies who are still eligible for marriage, they allow them to live and intermarry and all of that sort of thing. All right, so this is the very first opportunity we run into the Bible of genocide. Can a holy God allow these people to be put to death in this way? And the modern answer is no. The biblical answer is yes. When you sin, you're judged for those sins. And these people did everything they could to destroy God's people. And if you leave them around, they're going to keep doing everything they can to destroy God's people. And so God is showing them about the retribution that will come when this sin has been completed and this sin has been done. So pretty big deal as we run across that and as you see that. Okay. And in chapter 32, this is our last chapter. If you look on this map, look at that black star. That's where we're located. Okay. We've just destroyed the Ammonites or Moabites. We've just destroyed Moab. We've already destroyed Edom. We've worked our way up. Now, this is where the tribes are going to be placed. This is about 40 years later. But it kind of gives you an idea where we're at. The people of Gad and the people of Reuben, these people love their livestock. And they know across the Jordan River, it's mainly mountains. And it's mainly dry. And a great place for olives, great place for figs, great place for that sort of thing. But where they're at right now is just plains. Just flat, open plains. And if you love raising cattle, this is paradise. And so they go to Moses and they say, listen, we kind of like it right here. And I think, they're like, we think we're just going to stay right here. And Moses calls together Phinehas, or Eleazar, who's the high priest, calls a chieftain from each of the 12 tribes, and he says, you're going to get us all killed. The last time we were about to enter into the promised land, and somebody rejected it, remember those 10 spies? He said everybody in the nation died except Joshua and Caleb. We spent 40 years being cleansed, and now here you are doing the exact same thing. And they come back and they say, no, it's not the exact same thing. We want to build fortifications. We want to build houses to leave our children and our wives in, leave a few men back who can control it, but we will go and we will fight. Moses and the Lord agree to that, and so they end up going, all 12 tribes cross the Jordan, and they fight the battles, and when all the land is conquered, we see where Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh come back home. All right, so you see that where it happens. They agreed about the fight, but the decisions have consequences. When you're away from your brethren, when you don't come to, let's put it this way, when you don't come to church, okay, what happens to you? You fall away, your morality falls apart. The more you're around brethren, the stronger you are. When these people lived outside of the nation of Israel, with that natural border of the Jordan River, they got walloped quite often. Much of the book of Judges has to do with these people right here. Okay? All right. It's difficult to serve God. A lot of attention to sacrifice. Number 2, be a person of your word, especially towards God. Okay? Sin has consequences. Balak and Balaam died because of their sins. And you got to be there for your brethren. Even if your home is here, you need to go with them and fight their battles. Help them. Help one another. Bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ.